Good morning, everyone. And it is wonderful to be here in Hamilton and New Zealand, and it's my first visit to Hamilton, so I will take up the Mayor's offer to actually see the sites while I'm here. I'm really looking forward to it. And I'd like to also thank the Tainui people for the welcome to the Waikato region. It was a very wonderful welcome, and I really enjoyed it. I'd also like to acknowledge the dignitaries here today, Mayor Julie Haraka, the elected local council members, distinguished guests, Water New Zealand President and Board. Well, the Australian water journey and reform journey has been a long one, but it's only just really started. I think what we can all learn from each other is that the journey of water reform does not end. It is a continuous journey and is one that we must all remain committed to. Let's see if I can get there we go. So in Australia, the responsibility for managing water resides with the state governments under our constitution. And our state governments, actually, it was one of the reasons why it took a long time to federate our nation. Australian states argued very strongly for the retention of water management rights at the time of federation back in 1902. And the reason for that was water was a very, very significant component of navigation for the River Murray was a very big inland highway through the paddle steamer industry, and irrigation was just beginning. So they argued very strongly to maintain the right to manage water. This is all very interesting because water doesn't actually understand state boundaries. It doesn't understand that upstream and downstream users need to be able to work together. So it became very difficult and evident over many decades that there was a problem with the way in which this management was occurring. Early on, Australia decided to establish what they called the River Murray Commission, which was a commission that managed the waters of the River Murray system for particularly navigation purposes and also for irrigation purposes. There was no mention of the environment and there was no mention of the urban sector. So that's the basis on which water reform is set against in Australia. And it's particularly problematic because of the state boundaries, and decisions upstream can have a very significant impact and consequences for communities downstream. So why reform? Well, initially, Australia is a land of significant droughts and floods. And traditionally, water security relied on large dams and centralised water delivery systems, and with groundwater and surface water systems. We had ageing infrastructure, there was institutional fragmentation, inefficient regulation, and you've heard a bit about inefficient regulation already from Steve, and this created price distortions, and this was inhibiting the productivity of the water sector in Australia. We also have growing cities, just as you have growing cities, we have growing towns. We have competing demands, and those competing demands are quite significant. The rural sector versus the urban sector. This is nothing new to you. In Australia, it was becoming more and more evident that we had significantly over-allocated systems also, and climate change was starting to have an impact. For example, in the city of Perth, in the west of Australia, there was dams built in the 70s that have never filled. Water shortages, the answer was to build another dam. You built another dam and it never filled. In Western Australia, they have seen a step change in the runoff that they receive from rainfall. They've seen a step change in their available water, and they now rely heavily on desalinated water. In fact, every state in Australia now has desalination. The federal government of Australia, whilst it was not their responsibility to manage water, recognised that there were significant productivity gains to be achieved through the reform of the water sector. This led to what was called the 1995 COAG, or Council of Australian Governments, Water Reform Framework. It was incentivised negatively, it was managed out of Treasury, and it was driven by microeconomic reform agenda. The negative incentives were that if states did not show significant progress against the reform agenda on an annual basis, then the federal government reduced the amount of grants they gave to the states for other purposes. It worked. So what was the COAG reform agenda? Well, the COAG reform agenda, based on microeconomic reforms, as I said, had a number of key platforms to it. Initially, water pricing based on full cost recovery. We haven't quite achieved that yet, but we have made significant progress. Separation of water policy and water service businesses. In most of our capital cities, that has occurred, where our major water utilities have been separated from government agency-run organisations into corporatised entities, still owned by state governments, but in a separate corporatised entity. I'm actually on the board of one of those, which is SA Water in South Australia. It's a monopoly organisation wholly owned by the state government. Separation of water property rights from land title. Now, this was a very, very difficult one to do, but one that we have managed to achieve over the past 20 years in most areas of Australia. It's been a very important but very hard-won gain. The gains of this particular reform is that people were actually able to realise the asset value of their water as well as the asset value of their land. And once we had moved people from thinking about water and land being tied together into this idea that you could actually have a better realisation of your asset value through that separation, it would now be very, very difficult to go back on that decision because the communities, the rural sector in particular, have realised the benefits here. Establishment of tradable water entitlements and seasonal allocations. Now, this is an interesting idea because initially people had allocations given to them by the government or licences that were issued by government, and they expected to have access to those licences regardless of what the conditions were. Trade didn't exist, and therefore water was locked into where it was issued and where the licence was issued and the land on which it was issued, regardless of the productivity capacity of that water. The seasonal allocations have provided us with a mechanism now to be able to manage different water products in different areas according to how much water is available and to enable us to maximise the productive capacity of that water. It was fiercely opposed when it was initially proposed, and it took many, many years for us to be able to implement that particular policy. Water trading, including across borders. Now, this was a really difficult reform as well. Water trading across borders was particularly difficult because of the states managing the water and the states and the communities within those states wanting to retain the value of that water within their own environment. If you allow it to trade, it will trade out of our communities and our communities will be worse off for it. You've heard those arguments? They're arguments that need to be listened to, arguments that need to be understood, and the fears need to be allayed before we can move past the opposition to this particular reform agenda. But it has certainly made a huge difference in Australia. The interstate trade market that we now have is maturing. There are many different products that are available to be traded, and it has created an environment where water can move to its highest value. It also unlocks water from land and unlocks it from inefficient water use. The realisation of the value of water has enabled farmers to actually invest in new technology, to invest in new ways of configuring their businesses, and it has enabled them to have the capital value to do that they wouldn't otherwise have had. It was not an easy reform. I was Minister in South Australia from 2004 onwards. We were the downstream state. We have the smallest amount of irrigation, but probably the most efficient irrigation in the nation, although everyone tends to say that. We were actually nation leaders, though, in upgrading irrigation delivery systems. And we provided the opportunity for trade first. And we had a working party at the national level for water trade. And that working party of government officials, state government officials, met for nearly 10 years. And every meeting they'd go, yes, that made progress, and we did nothing. When I came in, it was my first goal to actually break the deadlock on trade. And the reason why trade was so difficult was because in Victoria, one upstream state from South Australia, they wanted a system called exchange rate trading. So they wanted the euro of the water trade. And the euro of the water trade was that if you bought water from upstream in Victoria somewhere and you traded it into South Australia, it actually had a trade offset, and you might only get 80% of what you actually bought because you were taking it downstream, more losses in the system. So they wanted to actually have the euro of water licensing for trade purposes. In New South Wales, they wanted what they called tagged trading. And that meant that if you bought a licence from New South Wales in South Australia, you actually bought a New South Wales licence, you kept a New South Wales licence, it had all the characteristics of a New South Wales licence, you were just taking it out in South Australia. Now, Victoria and New South Wales would not come to an agreement as to which way was the best way forward. And meanwhile, every year we were getting slugged by the federal government through this disincentive at the end of each year for not actually achieving progress against the water trade reform. So I ended up going around our government officials and negotiating directly with ministers in New South Wales and the minister in Victoria. And I negotiated to do tag trading with New South Wales and exchange trading with Victoria. My bureaucrats hated it. The administrative nightmare that caused to have two systems running concurrently without a system to be able to manage it, a computer system to manage it, was horrendous for the agency. However, it worked. It broke the deadlock, and it meant that the two states of New South Wales and Victoria saw what happened. Trade started to move. Water moved from New South Wales into Victoria via South Australia. The market worked out how to deliver water to where it wanted to go. It went from Victoria through South Australia into New South Wales, so the two governments finally realised they needed to actually do something about it and agreed upon a tag trading system which now works very, very well. So what happened then? 10 years, microeconomic reform, disincentives around the federal government encouraging states to move forward on the reform agenda, and after the first decade, governments realised that there was still a lot of work to be done. And they got together and they decided which bits were most important in relation to the next decade of water reform, and so the National Water Initiative was born. And the National Water Initiative was more specific. It's a document that's readily available. You can get it off our website, the National Water Commission's website. And as part of the National Water Initiative decision of COAG, it was decided to set up the National Water Commission, which I now currently chair. The National Water Commission had a role to oversee, oversight, assess, monitor and report to COAG, not to the federal government, not to any state government, but to the Council of Australian Governments, which is made up of the Prime Minister and the Premiers of each of the states and territories. And it was through that reporting process to COAG that kept everyone honest and on the track. There was no more incentives out of the federal government for this particular reform agenda. It was just agreed that it was easier to have a set of national principles to work towards, and that a reporting framework through to COAG that was very, very public enabled sufficient incentives for the states to continue the journey. What the National Water Initiative concentrated on was water access entitlements, but including planning and water allocation planning. Catchment management, water catchment management more broadly. Best practice water pricing was still on the list, and still is. Water markets and trading to be expanded beyond the Murray-Darling Basin, beyond the Murray into the Darling, and beyond the Murray-Darling Basin into the rest of the nation. Integrated management of the environment, so looking at total catchment management and really having an emphasis in our water planning that it was more than just about allocation of water for productive purposes, it was about managing the environment also. Water resource accounting, so that we could account for the water. Water metering, scary word. Fancy metering what you're taking. You cannot manage something if you don't know how much you're using. And it is a fundamental of any management practice is to measure what you're doing. And that was a big step in Australia also to actually get acceptance that metering was needed. We also spent a lot of time on knowledge and capacity building, and the establishment of the National Water Commission also came with a $250 million research program run by the National Water Commission to raise the national water standards. It was a very effective program and helped to fill a lot of the knowledge gaps. It was also a huge emphasis on community partnerships and adjustment. Now, the community partnerships and adjustment is critically important in the reform process, and it costs money. It is not cheap to go down the water reform agenda, and yes, someone has to pay. But at the end of the day, if we sit back and say it should be someone else, not us, we're kidding ourselves. The water reform agenda must be paid for, and it's generally paid for by the taxpayers either through their water utility charges, their rates, or their taxes at the federal level. So in that area, we also had urban water reform. Now, this particular area was quite underdone in the National Water Initiative, and there's been very little progress in that area, apart from some movement towards independent regulation, which I'll talk to in a moment. So what else was happening at the same time? Well, at the same time as all of this National Water Initiative agenda was going, there was also some significant other drivers for reform in Australia, such as the health agenda, healthy water, and water quality, the water quality within our river systems and the source point water for our urban utilities. There was a national water quality management strategy was established, and the Australian drinking water guidelines were developed. There was big investment, as I said, in the research component from a health perspective, but also from a catchment perspective. There was also the tightening of environmental legislation, which was putting pressure on the wastewater discharges, and I know that many of you will be having those difficulties as well. But it certainly led to significant investment in water treatment. You need these drivers to be able to enable investment to occur. That investment only occurs when there is a driver for that investment. In South Australia, for example, our Environment Protection Authority spent many years developing the Adelaide Coastal Waters Quality Improvement Plan. And once that came into play, it had a significant impact on what sort of nutrient levels could be disposed of in the Gulf off the city of Adelaide. Whilst that was in itself a terrific agenda to actually reduce the nutrient load into the Gulf, it led to some other significant innovation. That policy agenda meant that we started to look at things in the north of Adelaide and the south of Adelaide to what you could do with that water. So we now have some very innovative programs in South Australia where we treat the water, pump it out to irrigation areas. We grow all sorts of glasshouse produce in the north, but we also produce some fantastic wine. So wastewater to wine has become a very big thing in South Australia. We also have done quite a bit of work in the area of aquifer recharge with the treated water, and then pulling it up for reuse later when water is short as a consequence of drought. So that was all happening. So we had national water quality standards, we had drinking standards, we had coastal water standards, and then we had the Millennium Drought. Now, as a politician, or a former politician as I am now, I have learnt that you never waste a good crisis. It is the best opportunity you will ever have to actually accelerate reforms, and that's exactly what happened. We had all of this in process, though. We had all of these reform agendas that were chugging along in the background. We would never have achieved the success we've achieved in the last decade if it weren't for the drought, because it enabled us to just put everything that we were hoping to get done over the next 20 or 30 years on the table right now. As the city and the state at the end of the River Murray system, we faced seriously the prospect of running out of water. We were months away, just months away, from implementing a bottled water into homes for potable supply, because we were not going to be able to supply water of sufficient quality. The River Murray system was drying up. We were seeing the lakes at the bottom end diminishing in size rapidly, year by year by year. We had massive exposed acid sulphate soils. We had riverbank collapses. We had pumps going into the river. We couldn't reach the water anymore with our major offtakes to the City of Adelaide. We had to lower all of our pumping infrastructure. We had to build environmental bunds. We were planning for a weir, $140 million, to put a weir in place at the bottom end of the system to hold the water at a high enough level to keep our pumps operational at the lower level. And that $140 million weir would have been a sinking structure, and the first big flood that came along would have washed it away. But that's how close we came to running out of water. So, the existing sources had failed. The existing modelling that we used to actually base all of our planning failed. We could no longer look at history to plan for what we needed to do. We couldn't even look around the world Nowhere in the world was there an acid sulphate exposed event happening at the size that we were trying to deal with in South Australia. So, during that period of time, I was minister, and it was not a particularly good time to be minister from one perspective, because it certainly was a very high-pressured period. But on the other side, it was fantastic because I had licence to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I called together with the Premier and the two factions of the left and the right of the Labor Party, and just a little bit of history. I'm National Party. National Party's in coalition with the Liberal Party in government and in most states. I accepted a position in the Labor Cabinet to manage water. First time it's ever happened in Australia, but the issue was so important that that was the possibility. I was seen as the person who knew most about it, and so I was given the opportunity to do that job. I also called together a system of cabinet where all water matters had to come through one minister, and every chief executive that had anything to do with water had to report through me, and all of our decision making was done around a water security council that we established. I also appointed a water security commissioner, a water commissioner, and we had to do rapid fire decision. And in that regard, we actually pushed through a number of the major reforms that we needed to at the same time. So it's all under control. We're having a meeting in November, and we did. The Prime Minister called a meeting of premiers and water ministers together, and during that period of time we had to renegotiate all the water sharing arrangements to actually take into consideration that critical human needs was the first priority. Our water sharing arrangements didn't consider critical human needs. It considered irrigation, and it considered water flow for navigation purposes. So we had to renegotiate on a month-by-month basis for a period of 4 years. In that 4-year period, we established a basis of which the Australian government stepped into the water space for the very first time in a serious way. The Water Act was established, Water Act of 2007, and $13 billion was put on the table to actually deal with over-allocation and to deal with a new system of management, particularly the Murray-Darling Basin. So we had water running out, we had level 5 restrictions all around the nation, we had significant concern from communities, and the one thing you do know about communities is that they will accept change when the pain of staying the same becomes too hard. And the pain of staying the same had become far too hard. So what happened? Adelaide desalination plants everywhere. We all of a sudden had infrastructure going in all over the place. The GAP Recycled Water Project is the Glenelg to Adelaide pipeline, the Glenelg wastewater treatment plant. Needed to be upgraded to reduce nutrients going out to the Gulf, but also the opportunity came during the drought to actually use that water to pump it back into the city for the gardens around Adelaide. Adelaide is very similar to Christchurch, same town planner, with beautiful parklands all the way around the city, and it is now all watered through the Glenelg to Adelaide Recycled Water Project. Now that project would never have got off the ground because of the cost-benefit ratio of investment in that infrastructure against other supply options. But when you have no other supply options and your parklands are dying and your public amenity is being seriously affected, all of a sudden you're able to make these kind of investments. Water meter installations, well, there was a commitment nationally to meter all rural water and to meter urban water also. We also had significant investment in water quality monitoring and dealing with water source pollutants. Across the nation, every state and territory developed long-term water management plans. We'd never had long-term water management plans before. We'd had water management plans based on our 5-year CapEx or our 10-year CapEx or our 5-year OpEx plans. We'd never had long-term whole-of-catchment water management plans. The Water for Good one in green was the one that I developed in South Australia. It has 94 recommendations, of which 90 have already been implemented and the other 4 are being worked on. It is a plan out to 2050 and with a process of annual review. So what happened during that period of time was our communities became extremely aware of the value of water. They reacted positively. We have not seen a bounce back to water use levels pre-drought, post-drought. In 2010, the drought broke and our dams and major supplies returned to some sort of normal operating levels, and our community did not bounce back. That's very good for water conservation, not so good for water utilities. Because all of a sudden people are saving water and we need to charge them more for it because they're using less of it. Do you reckon communities understand that? One of the things we didn't do well was actually bring our community along on the journey with us about the complexities of water and an understanding of what is needed to run a water utility. That using less water doesn't mean you have less infrastructure or less costs. The water itself is probably the cheapest part of the situation. And our communities don't understand that. We are actually victims of our own success. We have been providing very good quality water into the homes of people 24/7, 365 days a year, very cheaply. It has become an expected thing to turn on the tap and it will be there. So, what do we need to do? What do we need to do to actually engage our customers better? Well, we've got lots of challenges still. We've had lots of progress, and I'm not for 1 minute resiling from the fact that over the last 20 years we have been extremely successful in achieving some substantial reforms in Australia. But we have been on a journey of reform and will continue to do so. Our challenges coming up? Well, we're actually just about to launch our final document. The National Water Commission is being wound up by this document at the end by this government by the end of this year, and we're about to embark upon the next decade, what the next decade will look like. And so in our final report, which we're actually releasing next month, we'll be focusing on a stronger urban agenda. We'll also be focusing on the solid long-term planning that includes all options for future augmentation. That includes whole of water cycle, your storm water, your wastewater reuse. When you're actually dealing with the next augmentation challenge for your city or your town, you should be able to consider all of the options and not have some politically ruled out. If the science says it can be done, then it should be assessed on the basis of cost and benefits, not on political intervention. Nationally consistent independent regulation is something we need to do a lot of work on. We have independent regulators in each state, and each of them has a different set of regulatory terms and conditions that they operate under, and most of them are still significantly subjected to political intervention, particularly in regard to pricing. And in actual fact, the dividend drives the pricing structure more than what the need of the utility is to provide a long-term asset for communities, not only this generation but the next generation. We need to build the National Water Initiative principles into future decision making, and this is a really important one. In Australia we have a strong push to develop the north. The north of Australia has a lot of water, very variable water systems, but a lot of water, and most of our development is in the south and the southeast. There is a strong push from this government and across the nation to look at the opportunities to develop the north, but in doing so we must take into consideration the lessons of the past and actually ensure the decisions that we make in regard to new development in the north are based on those sound principles and the lessons learned. These are very, very big challenges still. And at our national level, the federal government has decided we've interfered enough back to the states. The states have sort of gone back into their cubby holes and said, we're right, we'll look after this for now. And fortunately for the nation and for Australia, the industry is going, well, hang on a minute, maybe it's our turn. The Australian Water Association and the Water Services Association of Australia, which is our major utilities, are coming together and working more strongly together than they ever have. They're working with the National Water Commission and they're working with states to say it's all very well and good to think you're right back in your states, but you're not. There is a national imperative here and productivity is important. Water needs to move to a different space. For the last decade, the water policy position out of the federal government has been sitting with the Department of Environment, which is great. because it's put the environment into the water policy domain where it hasn't been before. We've actually dealt with a lot of the over-allocation issues. We have embedded in our legislation now the roadmap and the blueprint that enables decisions to be made in a sustainable way in most states. What we need to do now is think of that water that is available for productive use as to how we can better use it. And we don't need to look at it as a constraint, we need to look at it as an enabler of the productivity of our nation. There's still the competing demands: agriculture and water, energy and water, mining and water, urban sector and water. There are still those issues that need to be dealt with and managed very, very carefully. And there's one thing I've found in the water debate, is that if you put 11 people in a room, you'll get 12 different positions. And each of those positions is as important as each other, and they need to be listened to, they need to be understood, and a pathway forward needs to be found. There is no point in banging heads and saying I'm right and you're wrong. Because in each of those sectors, each of those groups has a reason for their positioning, and that is a reason that should be respected. Once you actually get that respect for what's driving that position, you can then start to move the thinking forward. Might not be on the same track initially, but it will be moving in the same direction. And that's when you start to move towards consensus decision making. The loggerheads that we have had to work through in Australia are no different to what you will have to work through here, what anyone in the world who is trying to embark upon water reform will have to work through. And it's about getting people in the room and getting them to understand the other side and the other perspective, and recognise and acknowledge that their issues are important and need to be dealt with as well. So, the end goal is livability and affordability. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Water underpins the livability of our cities, it underpins the livability of our economy, and it needs to be considered as an enabler of both. The end of the National Water Commission era is not the end of national water reform in Australia, and I'm excited about the prospect of us being able to put water as an enabler front and centre for the next decade of reform in Australia. It won't be easy. There's challenges, and that's why we're all here. Congratulations to Water New Zealand for holding this very important forum, and for you all coming along, because it's the fact that you're turning up that is the start of the process and the continuance of the process of reform, and recognising that reform is needed. That is the most difficult decision. When you realise that reform is needed, then you can start to move forward. There is no point in sitting in your corners, waiting for the bell and then coming out with your fists up. You need to sit down and you need to work these issues through. Good luck with your reform journey. I wish you well, and please do learn the lessons in Australia. We've come a long way, we've got a long way to go, we've made lots of mistakes and we've made lots of progress. And we can learn from each other. Good luck with the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karlene, for that excellent presentation and understanding of Australia. I've spent a bit of time over there myself, and it's been interesting to see the changes over there over the past decade and compared to what's happened here. We've got time for one or two questions for Karlene. If anyone would like to ask a question, put your hand up.
I've got one specific about Australia. My understanding is, I'm not sure what the status is now, but there was a policy of providing water at a uniform cost to everyone in the state. So you had a situation where remote communities at horrendous cost to the state government were being subsidised quite heavily. So you had SA Water paying a dividend to the state government with one hand and taking back the service guarantee with the other. What's the status of that at the moment? What are your thoughts about how to move that situation forward?
Postage stamp pricing still exists in South Australia, and it exists for the reason that it's a very large state with a very centralised population and very remote populations. The difficulty of water policy makers is that if you didn't actually have that kind of facility, it would be very difficult to attract industry and communities outside of the City of Adelaide. The idea of the dividend being paid and then what we call our customer service obligation being paid out of general revenue back is an attempt at transparency in that process. It has not worked properly. We need to be far more open and transparent about subsidies. People need to understand what it's costing them for delivery and that the state is subsidising it. And then those that are subsidising are not going to be happy as their bills go up as they're continuing to subsidise. That will start to break down that environment. And when that environment starts to break down, what will then occur, in my view, is you'll get innovation out in those remoter communities in relation to how they supply water. And it certainly will change the landscape dramatically. At this point in time, the state government has no intention of changing that policy. It's a political minefield, but there is a move towards greater transparency and greater understanding of those issues. Customers need to understand their water supply systems far more, and they need to be better engaged with the utility in what risks they're prepared to take and what level of investment they want to see, not only for this generation but for the next generation. That's, I think, where our next big challenge is in the urban sector, is getting customers to understand better and to come along the journey with us.
Thanks very much for that extremely interesting conversation. In New Zealand, reform has been bottom up rather than top down. A blueprint for water reform was provided by an institution called the Land and Water Forum, whose recommendations the government is currently in the process of implementing. I wondered how much in Australia you've used collaborative processes, which you referred to at the end of your speech.
The collaborative process of COAG was critically important, and as a state government it's always useful to have a national set of principles agreed to by all parties that you need to conform with. It helps you in your own state and your own government environment drag Treasury along on the debate. It's very difficult where you have strong competing demands for the very limited resources that each government has to spend, and you want yours to be front and centre, and it helps to have that national set of principles that's being agreed to by Prime Minister and Premiers that you can use as your hook in your own state. So Big Brother's telling us what to do. Even though we agreed to what Big Brother has put out there, it enables us to actually drive the agenda more strongly by having that national set of principles to work towards. The collaboration was critically important. The monthly meetings we had, for example, on the Murray-Darling Basin during the drought were significant drivers of the accelerated reform agenda. And the national approaches for the Murray-Darling Basin in particular, in the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, was strong. That was all about the states sitting down together and having to get consensus to move forward. That consensus was very difficult to achieve, but once it was achieved, it was locked in for life. You could never go back on it. And so you actually got incremental reforms over a period of time. It took the Millennium Drought for the federal government to step in and say there must be a better way to do this, and we're going to take a bit more control in this area. Once they did that, the Murray-Darling Basin Commission was disbanded, a new Murray-Darling Basin Authority was established, but under that the states still have a significant contribution to make through a ministerial council that supports the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. There are still some weaknesses in that framework, and I think they will evolve over the next little while, particularly with the federal government taking a back step in the lead for water reform in the nation, and I think you'll find that the states will step back into that space through that collaborative approach again. New South Wales is a really good example, though, that you could probably have a look at from a New Zealand perspective, because New South Wales still has many of their utilities run by local government, and there's 105 different local government utilities providing water and wastewater to communities, and they're a long way off the reforms that we've seen in the major capital cities and the state-owned assets, and they're going through the process of now looking at regional collaborations and looking at how they provide the skill base and how they're going to be able to get the capital that's needed to replace assets, because there's a big cliff face coming very, very soon, and they're working very collaboratively together. Sometimes in that reform agenda as well. It's not an easy one though, because you've got lots of small councils. You've got lots of small councils who've got different budgetary positions. Some are in debt, some aren't in debt, and how do you partner those up to actually to make it work? But they are conversations that need to be had, and conversations that need to be worked through in a very structured way so that people can feel that their needs are being met.
Okay, we'll probably leave it there for now, but once again, Karlene, thank you very much. I can't guarantee that our wine has been filtered, our wine has come from wastewater, but it's a gift. And once again, on behalf of Water New Zealand, I really appreciate taking the time to come over here. Thank you very much.